Hi everyone, welcome back. So last time we looked at a summary of Ender's Game, and this time we're going to talk a little bit about the controversies of the book, why it's been banned, why it was edited, and then we will also talk a bit about some of the technology in the book. Since this is a hard science fiction, military fiction book, there is a lot of tech. Next time we'll look at the psychology of the characters, and we'll talk about some of the social science aspects of the novel and some of the historical aspects as well. So let's dive in. I want to start with this question that was posed to Orson Scott Card on one of his fan websites, and he went through and answered some questions kind of in a brief interview. And the person says, as an assignment for my English course, we were required to read a banned book and write a paper examining the reasons for its banishment. I chose Ender's Game. One of the reasons it was banned was due to profanity and sexuality. What are your thoughts about banned books? Orson Scott Card replied, Ender's Game was banned because of sexuality? Ha, there's no sexuality in the book, period, unless somebody thinks that showering naked is sexual. The reason Ender's Game was first banned is because it was placed on a hit list of evil group books by a group many years ago, and it was placed on that list for no other reason than I am Mormon, and therefore no children should be reading a book by me. So that is his, he says later, it was also, it quote, cultivated anti-adult attitudes. Whenever I see this as an excuse or reason, I say that's pretty much all of young adult literature. That's Megan talking. But he says, whenever I see this as an excuse or reason, I know that the source is a Baptist list, which makes it hilarious because it was also once banned in Utah because of the efforts of a Mormon who had picked up the Baptist list and didn't realize that one way to be on the list was just to be Mormon. So his response is basically that it's people who are attacking him. I would say, is there sexuality in the book? It's a really good question. If you look out there, there are some critics who see this book as being homoerotic, almost pedophiliac. So there are things in here such as the quote I put in my notes, Ender turned to the door. A boy stood there, tall and dark and slender, with beautiful black eyes and slender lips that hinted at refinement. I would follow such beauty, said something inside Ender. I would see as those eyes would see. So the thing is that, interestingly enough, while some people saw this as being homoerotic and meaning that there are kind of homosexual undertones, even though there's not actual sex or sexual contact in the book, other people point to the fact that Orson Scott Card has been really an opponent of the LGBT movement. He is part of a coalition for family values. I don't remember exactly the name of it, but that's sort of what they say they stand for. And he might even talk about this in the interview. I can't remember completely the interview that I'm going to give you guys to watch. But he really has said that he is really an opponent of the LGBT movement, and he has been very outspoken about that. And for that reason, some people on the other side of the spectrum have banned the book or said that they're not going to read the book. There are other people who say these homoerotic elements, it's because you have a group of boys who kind of like Lord of the Flies. They are fighting, they're attacking each other. There are very few female characters. Petra is one of the only girls who is in this military training group, and that you are kind of assaulting the weak and trying to look for who's the strongest, who's kind of like that alpha male idea. So it's very interesting that people have looked at it from two different sides. That people on one side say, look, there's some weird like undertones of sexuality. People on other sides say there's not and also Orson Scott Card is homophobic and therefore we should not read it. So it kind of gets banned because of both of those things. Another reason that it was banned was because there's some racial language in here as well that is incredibly problematic, and depending on what edition you guys have gotten, I'm not sure if it would be in there or not. So Orson Scott Card revised this book in the 1990s, and some of it was due to the fact that there are references in the book as it was originally written to the Soviet Union, and by the time in the 1990s, the Soviet Union had basically collapsed, right? So I think he revised it in 91 or 92, so right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to try to kind of update it. When he did that, he also updated some of the language. So it will depend on what version you have. The way that they talk about characters who are Black, who are Jewish, who are Muslim or who used to be Muslim, again, there's a little bit of an erasure of culture and erasure of religion, at least an attempt to erase those things by the government after the war with the buggers. But the way that some of those characters are talked about and described, there is also some of the slang that the boys are using, calling each other's names and things like that. So things like big nose and things like that to denigrate someone who is ethnically Jewish. So I will, if I can, I'll find for you guys something that kind of has a little bit of a comparison of the language. But this is another reason that people have banned the book, or at least the original version of the book, as opposed to the edited version, which came out about 6 years later. So those are some of the controversies. I think another controversy around the book is just the amount of violence that's in it. That this is a book, again, I mentioned before, that has a protagonist who is 6 at the beginning. On paper, he's 6. I would say he's not 6. I would say that the film version that has him a little bit older, I hate the movie, but that's one of the few things I think the movie got right. They cast somebody who is a Butterfield, is a very like baby-faced guy, and a little bit older than the age of 6. But he's supposed to be a genius. The thing about 6-year-old geniuses is that they very often have developed, as we saw like with Flowers for Algernon, right? Somebody who's 6, who's a genius, has developed intellectually, but not socially or emotionally. So we'll talk next time a little bit more about the psychological complexities that go into that. But you do have a young protagonist. You do have quite a bit of violence. Ender is in some fights at school before he's called to the military. He's in fights while he's in the military. There are repercussions from those fights. I don't want to give too much away, but there is also, it's a military science fiction book. You know, the purpose of military science fiction is to explore how technology would be used in times of war, you know, as speculation. What if we had to fight in zero gravity? What would that look like? How would we do hand-to-hand combat? How would we train for that? How would we do battle simulations? All of that kind of thing. So, yeah, so the tech that we're going to talk about in a minute, I think, has a lot to do with the reason that this is banned. I think that you have a book that's essentially like a PG-13 book with a 6-year-old protagonist. At least that's how old he's supposed to be at the beginning. And so, yeah, some parents aren't going to like that. Most books, like most movies, you can have a very violent movie that's rated PG-13 instead of R, and then you have a movie with, like, you know, one nipple in it and it gets an R rating as opposed to a PG-13. So a lot of times things are banned or challenged for reasons of sexuality rather than rather than violence. But I think some parents probably would challenge this because of violence. So just some things to know, some things to look for. Think about kind of like we talked about with Wrinkle in Time. At what age would you let a kid read this? And would you feel comfortable just having them read it on their own? Or would you want to read it with them or talk to them about it, at least talk with them about some of the ideas in it? So let's talk about the tech. What's so interesting to me, and one of the reasons that I chose this book for you guys, is because really a lot of the technology he was looking forward, but not that far forward. So other than this idea that you have aliens in outer space and a war in space, really a lot of the tech here is stuff that we have today. So at first, Ender has this tracker, and he is in school and he's getting the tracker taken out. The tracker is almost like a combination between a GPS and a body cam that a lot of police officers are being asked to wear for obvious reasons. So this tracks his movements, they can record things, and they're seeing things almost from his perspective. I think the tech is almost purposefully vague the way that Orson Scott Card describes it, because you don't need to know every wire and every synapse and how that all works. But essentially, we could have something similar. I would say that this is more like probably connected to his brain a little bit more, and they're actually seeing from his eyes and from his perspective. But I think that you could simulate this by hooking up something with body cam and GPS and maybe, a mic, something like that. We also have later on description of the kids at this military school going to their desks. Their desks are very clearly personal computers. They also have tablets. These are networked. So did they have a network at this point in time? Yes, but not quite as sophisticated as the kind he's talking about. Because the internet was essentially invented in 1983, but didn't become available to the public until 1991. So Card is kind of looking at this new type of communication and how there can be computer networks, and those networks can communicate to each other. Now, interestingly enough, as we read the quote from last time, a lot of people think that this is a book that, there are problems with communication. And so on the one hand, you have these desktops or personal computers and then even tablets that are communicating to each other, and yet the people in the story have some difficulties communicating. And certainly with the alien race, there is not good communication, hence the war. And then we have the internet down on Earth, where Peter and Valentine begin to manipulate information for political purposes. So this idea that he had is kind of, again, the speculation. If we had computers that could talk to each other, if we had things that were networked, how would people use those to communicate? And if they did use those to communicate, what problems would arise? This is one of the other reasons that I picked this book for you guys at this point in time. Trolling online, beginning with message boards and then spreading to social media, certainly things like Facebook, Twitter, I don't think Orson Scott Card quite conceptualized, but definitely message boards. And then we have problems like with QAnon, where there are conspiracy theories and there are people putting out false information for political purposes. They are doing this in a way that is anonymous and that cannot fully be tracked. So this is another quotation from the book, and then I'm going to read you something else that Card says about this type of use of technology. So this is about Peter and Valentine, who are, they create or construct these kind of fictional personalities of Locke and Demosthenes. Demosthenes. I never pronounced that correctly. Demosthenes. So they basically are trying to infiltrate circles of political power. So here's what he says. They stayed away from the nets that required the use of a real name. That wasn't hard because with real names, that only had to do with money. They didn't need money. They needed respect, and that they could earn. With false names on the right nets, they could be anybody. Old men, middle-aged women, anybody, as long as they were careful about the way they wrote. All that anyone would see were their words, their ideas. Every citizen started equal on the nets. They were not bland, and people answered. The responses that got posted on the public nets were vinegar, and the responses that were sent as mail for Peter and Valentine to read privately were poisonous. But they did learn what attributes of their writing were seized upon as childish and immature, and they got better. So this idea particularly that they were not bland, I was listening to some podcasts the other day about the way that YouTube uses algorithms. Many people are never going to see this unless they specifically type into YouTube like Ender's Game analysis of technology or something like that. But a lot of YouTube algorithms are set to increase or spike information that is louder, that becomes more popular, the loudest person in the room. So you have essentially, I'm saying louder, but I mean basically extreme. So if you search for something about diets, you might eventually find things about pro-anorexia or pro-bulimia kind of sites, and very quickly because of that algorithm, as opposed to something like body kindness, which might not come up, which is a lot more moderate look at taking care of yourself. Things like self-care are not going to be things that you see. So yeah, a lot of the idea, what goes viral, things that are funny or crazy, but also things that are extreme. What kind of messaging is spread during an election? It's not going to be the quietest person in the room. And that idea that they're getting vinegar and poison responses back to them, and that this is all being done really online. So this is what Card says about the ability to regulate information. What few people understand is the fragility of our power. It does not come from great armies or irresistible armadas. It comes from our control of the network of ansibles that carry information instantly from world to world. No world dares to offend us because they would be cut off from advances in science, technology, art, literature, learning, and entertainment, except what their own world might produce. We need no weapons because the only weapon that matters, the ansible, is completely under our control. Now, that comes in a later work, but he's got the same idea here, the idea that there is political authority. And certainly Ender is kind of playing around with this idea as well. Who is getting information? Who is getting training? What kind of training are they getting? How is one thing that he does pretty early on in the book. He hacks into this network of desks in a classroom to send messages about one of his fellow launchees, one of the people that he's in this military school with who's been kind of a bully. And then he waits to see how people respond to this message, who sees it, how they could be on his side or could be not on his side. So again, this idea of controlling information. So at the same point, we also have video games and computers being used to teach. The video game that Ender plays is a type of almost psychological tool that the adults at the school are using to watch his development, and it's an adaptive game, which I find really fascinating. Orson Scott Card has done tons of interviews just about video games and video game systems. He loved playing video games even at this point, and he was kind of looking forward to, like, what if you had a game that would be adaptive to your psychology? So it's not just like you go from this level to this level, but you do this and then you make this choice. And if you make this choice, it goes up here. If you make that choice, you go down here. We use this in teaching all of the time. There are adaptive programs for even more mundane things like math. If you do some problems and you get some wrong, it'll give you more of those problems. It'll give you easier problems. If you get those right, it'll move you up to harder ones, right? So watch for that and how it's almost a type of virtual reality, which is another thing that he's speculating on here. And those simulations, why they become kind of an important piece to understanding what's going on in Ender's mind. We have other things. We have zero gravity fighting. We have freezing guns, drones, the idea that you'd be able to send out a drone and attack something without actually having a soldier there, which again is something we have today. And then also these training simulations. I'm going to give you guys an article, and if you're not in my class, I'll put it in the notes. But I'm going to give you an article about military groups saying that basically we are in the time of Ender's Game right now. We have training simulations for combat, for flight that are quite realistic, that incorporate these ideas of video games and virtual reality and adaptation to adapt to our fighting styles. And I think it's really fascinating the way that Card is kind of asking these questions, right, that we've talked about the whole term. Can we, and if we can, should we, and what would this kind of look like in real life? So some technology that we don't have yet and some things that are still possibly in the future, but a lot that has been pretty accurately predicted. And I think that that's very interesting. So look for those things, the technology, particularly the control and use of information, and the ways that Ender seems to really, as the technology adapts to him, Ender also adapts to the technology. So look for that as well, and how that shows some of his leadership potential. And we'll talk more about that next time. Thanks, everybody.